Okay, so good morning, good day, good afternoon, and good evening. Once again, you are welcome to the subject Human Rights Education. And for today's lecture or for this video, the focus is on the international humanitarian law. So there is an image there. It says there that protecting the defenseless in times of armed conflict. Okay, so with that, you already have a bird's eye view on what is the international humanitarian law. So at the end of this lesson or this video, the viewers or the learners are expected to understand the concept and purposes of the international humanitarian law, as well as to explain the principles and the limitations of the international humanitarian law. So we have heard about wars, okay, going on right now in other countries, in some continents, patuloy ang may mga gera. Now, sa mga gera, may mga bawal kasi, no? May mga limitations yan. And the question now is, who shall impose? At ano dapat ang masusunod? So, the United Nations came up with the International Humanitarian Law. And it is considered or called as the Law of Armed Conflict or the LOAC. At the same time, the Law of War. Kasi ito ina-apply during times of war between nations or between countries. So it may overlap with arms control and international human rights law and forms the basis of a large part of the international criminal law because it overlaps those things because yung tawag natin yung war on crimes are also violations of the international human rights. Kaya natawag natin na nag-overlap itong mga batas na ito, itong mga international laws na mga ito. Okay, so basically this is an agreement of the nations under the United Nations. So further, the IHL pertains to the set of rules which seek for humanitarian reasons, okay, to limit the effects of armed conflict. So para mabawasan yung inhumanity or destruction kung magkaroon man ng giyera. In other words, ang international humanitarian law does not prohibit war between countries, but rather it only set rules for the limitation of the effects of armed conflict. And in this IHL, it also provide for the protection of persons who are not or no longer participating in the hostilities and the restriction of the means and methods of warfare. Okay? Sino yung mga dapat maproteksyonan in times of war at ano yung mga restriction na mga estratehiya or taktika or mga methods or mga weapons doon sa warfare. Okay? We are going to take a look on those matters as we move on. So, the international humanitarian law can be found in, we call it resolutions in the Geneva Convention of 1949, in which most of the states in the world agreed to be bound by them or to be governed by the international humanitarian law in case their country go against another country. And further, the conventions have been developed and supplemented by further agreements, just like the additional protocols of 1977 relating to the protection of victims of armed conflicts. Okay, so hindi lang minsanan. Until ngayon, actually, ay nagkakaroon ng United Nations Conventions para titignan nila kung ano yung mga dapat na gagawin para mabawasan or maiwasan yung destruction of lives and properties in case of war. And there are also other agreements prohibiting the use of certain weapons and military tactics and protecting certain categories of people and goods na part pa rin yan ng international humanitarian law. So, what are those agreements? Okay, you have the 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. Ano yon? Yung mga, say for example, mga mosque, mga templo, yan, mga churches, no? Mga mga heritage building na tinatawag natin. So, dapat yun, hindi yun galawin during armed conflict na tawag noon. And the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, kasi ang biological weapon, it will cause mass destruction, even children and even animals, no? Yung mga livelihood or mga livestock ng mga tao na kinamumuhay nila ay maaring masama. Kaya hindi pwede yun. Conventional weapons on convention and its 5 protocols. Ano yung conventional weapons? Yung mga traditional weapons na ano ba yung inaalaw na weapon. Okay? And the chemical weapons convention, just like the biological weapon convention, to naman, ano yung mga pinagbabawal na chemical warfare. Kasi nga yung chemical warfare na yan, eh ganun din. It will cause massive destruction of humanity as well as their properties and livestock. The Ottawa Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines, ano yan? Yung mga paggamit ng booby traps, paggamit ng mga landmines, binabawal yan. Okay? Then, optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the Involvement of Children in Arms, meaning pinagbabawal na yung mga minors ay isali sa armed conflict. They are going to be armed. So that is very obvious. The New People's Army is a violator of that kasi they employ children, okay, and they train children as early as elementary to uh, we call it to master the handling of weapon and to be used later on against the government. No? So, if those things are true, and I believe they are true, ay talagang violator ang New People's Army yan. So, ano ang ginagawa o ano ang gagawin or ginagawa ng IHL? Again, going back to limit as much as possible the suffering, loss, and damage caused by armed conflict. Ayan. So, dapat wag sanang maggera doon sa mga heavily populated places if ever. Kung ganun pa man, iwasan yung pag-atake sa mga civilian institutions or organizations or places. Dapat yung mga military camps lamang ang tinatarget supposedly. Okay? What else? The protection of those who are not or no longer taking part in fighting. So, hindi naman sila kasama sa armed fighting, yung mga bata, matatanda, okay? Mga disabled persons, yung mga prisoners of war, yung mga wounded in action, they are no longer taking part in the fighting kasi they are inside the prison. And of course, restriction on the means of warfare, in particular weapons, and the methods of warfare such as military tactics. Ano yung mga restrictions? Okay, so titignan natin ano mga yan. Say, protection of those who are not part or who are no longer taking part, ito mga yon. Okay? In the ISL, it tries to protect the civilians. Okay? So if they are obviously not participating in the armed conflict, then they should be protected by at all costs. Then the medical and religious military personnel, yung mga imams, mga pastors, mga pari, mga chaplains, obviously, mga non-combatant ang tawag natin dyan. Even the medical personnel, they are what you call non-combatant. Kaya sa Pilipinas, no, ay kumbaga, ay maraming ganon na inaatake yung mga non-combatants na mga pulis. So, for example, if you belong to the SOCO, mga non-combatants mga yan. So pag inambus ng NPA yan, may violation sila. So those who have ceased to take part in the action, such as wounded, okay, and then na-shipwreck sila, bumagsak yung eroplano or lumubog yung barko. So they're no longer nandun sila. Wag mo nang bumbahin pa, no? And sick combatants and prisoners of war okay, they should be protected by this IHL. What about the restrictions? Ano ba yung restriction pinagbabawal on weapons and tactics? These are the weapons or tactics that fail to discriminate between those taking part in the fighting and those such as civilians who are not. The purpose being to protect the civilian population, individual civilians, and civilian property. So, ibig sabihin yan, dapat yung taktika mo ay talagang you can discriminately identify, meaning alam mo na ito ang atikihin. Yung weapons mo, yun lang pupuntahan niya, hindi dun sa pupunta sa civilian building. So, yun ang ibig sabihin niyan. So, bawal naman ngayon. Kapag sporadic na or random na yung pag-atake, to whom it may concern, delikado yon. So, pwedeng kasuhan yan sa International Criminal Court, yung mga bansa na tinatawag natin hindi tumutupad niyan. Or those weapons that can cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. So, pag binaril mo, wasak yung ulo, lahat. Okay? So, hindi naman na necessary. Kaya pinagbabawal yung mga dum-dum bullets at saka mayroong mga sizes ang mga ginagamit na mga projectile. Hindi pwedeng napakalaki yung mga sizes ng projectile kasi ang purpose niyan is only to kill and to disable the enemy. And so may mga bala na or mga projectile at mga weapons na pinagbabawal ng United Nations when armed conflict arises between two countries. And those evidence that can cause severe or long-term damage to the environment. Kaya so tignan natin. Mga yan, yung mga booby traps at mga landmines. Okay? So yan ay tinatawag natin, delikado yan sa mga sibilyan. Kasi pag hinuhukay mo yan sa mga landmines kasi, pag naapakan yan, nagdi-detonate yan. So ngayon, saan nila nilalagay yan? So, doon sa mga lugar na kung saan maaring hindi military ang mabiktima, maaring mga farmers or mga civilian na hindi kasama sa armed conflict, maapakan nila yon. Okay, so ganun ang bawal talaga yan. Pero sa Pilipinas, gumagamit ang NPA ng mga landmines. So bawal yon, bawal gumamit ng landmines kasi iiwan nila yan eh. Lalagay sa kalsada. Okay, paano kung hindi yung target nila ng mga military personnel, police personnel ang nakasagasa noon? Paano pag civilian? So bawal gamitin ng mga yan, mga landmines, okay? So what else? Yung tinatawag nating mga weapons of mass destructions, the nuclear weapons. So yung effect niyan ay long term. Magkakaroon ng mga cancer, pati mga maging anak. So sa radiation yan, so pinagbabawal yan. Okay, kaya ang mga strong nations like the America ay inaatake nila yung ibang bansa na may mga tinatagong mga nuclear weapons. Pinapahinto sila doon kasi bawal yan. And then biological weapons like anthrax. Okay? So yung mga, say for example, sabi nila, ang COVID daw ay part ng biological warfare ng China. Okay? O kaya naman ay yung mga baril ninyo, mga weapons ninyo ay ang projectile niya may daladalang mga biological viruses na pagtama dun sa sentro ng city, lahat ng tao doon ay maapektuhan sa virus na daladala ng projectile. So bawal mo yun. The chemical warfare also. Ito yung mga chemicals na gagamitin tapos mag-focus ng massive injury sa mga tao at sa mga properties and even livestock. So bawal ang mga yan, pinagbabawal yan ng IHL or the International Human Rights Law. Then what the International Humanitarian Law does not do and what the IHL cannot do. Okay? Ang hindi niya kayang gawin ay to stop people fighting each other. Kasi nga, ay may karapatan yung mga countries na sila ay makipaggera sa iba, particularly when their rights are already trampled or when their sovereignty is already violated by another country. So hindi kayang pigilan ng IHL yung gera. Okay? And that's why, sabi nga ni Albert Einstein, as long as there are sovereign nations possessing great power, war is inevitable, meaning hindi pwedeng tanggalin yan. Kasi pinag-usapan ng sovereignty. So, hindi kayang stop ng IHL yan. Ang kaya nilang gawin ay tawag natin, bawasan, ma-prevent ang mga unnecessary distractions. Okay? So they cannot stop people suffering in war. Di nila mapigilan, that is a collateral damage. So ang IHL, pumapasok lang yan para yung mga hindi dapat na masira ay hindi dapat masira at hindi dapat mamatay, hindi dapat mamatay. Yun ang pwedeng gawin ng international human rights law. So what are the basic principles ng international human rights law? First, the military necessity. Ito yung nabanggit natin na hindi kayang pigilan ng IHL ang giyera because state involved in armed conflict is justified in using such lawful force as is necessary to bring about the submission of the enemy. So, karapatan ng bansa yan na kailangan talunin niya yung naggera sa kanya. Pero, kailangan mabilisan, the earliest possible moment matapos yung invasion or yung gera. Kasi pag long term yung invasion niyan, say for example, just like World War II and World War I, kung saan taon ang inabot, ay napakalaki ng damage sa mga bansa na na-involved doon. And supposedly, the least possible cost to itself in terms of lives and resources. Kaya binabanatan nila yung mga main na mga military camp kasi para pag nasira mga yon ay hindi mag-stop na ang gera, parang ganon. And a state also has the right to defend its unity and territorial integrity by all legitimate means. Yan ang sinabi ko kanina na merong tayong sovereignty. Kapag na-trample na or na-violate na ang sovereignty ng isang bansa, karapatan niya yon na ipagtanggol yung kanyang pagkakaisa at yung kanyang territorial integrity. So, uh, hindi kayang stop ng IHL yun. So, papasok lang IHL again to protect those who are not involved in war and to restrict the use of weapons and tactics that may cause unnecessary death or injury or damage to property. What else? The principle of humanity. Not even armed conflict releases mankind from the most basic of obligations in the respect of fellow human rights. Meaning, hindi porke may gera ay hindi mo na irespeto ang humanity. Kailangan kung may gera ay irespeto mo pa rin yung human dignity. That's why may nakakasuhan ng tinatawag nating uh, yung war law na tinatawag natin or the code of war, no? May mga nakakasuhan diyan. Okay? The violations of the war codes or war laws. And the principle forbids the infliction of suffering or destruction not necessary for the accomplishment of legitimate military purposes. Ayan, masyadong torture na yung mga tao. Hindi pwede yun, or masyadong torture na yung namatay na kalaban. Namatay na, ginilitan pa ng leeg, nilaslas pa yung mukha, hindi na kailangan yun. Okay, mga violation na yun ng human rights. Okay? Ayan. The basic principle of the international human rights law is that proportionality or balance. There must be a balance between military necessity and humanity. Yes, that is necessary na gawin ng military yan. Pero, tignan mo rin on the humanity side of your action. As a consideration in the formulation of rules of IHL, just like in drafting a treaty seeking to ban or restricting the use of a particular weapon. Okay? And then, an element of how some rules of IHL are applied, meaning those rules acquiring precautions in favor of civilians when launching attacks. Okay? So, tinitignan palagi yun na dapat it will restrict the use of weapons of massive destruction and the inclusion of civilians doon sa gera. Okay? So, what else? What about the limitations? When does international humanitarian law apply? It applies only to armed conflict. It does not cover internal tension or disturbances such as isolated acts of violence. Meaning, Kagaya sa Pilipinas, hindi pwedeng i-apply mo yung IHL doon sa mga war between the country and the insurgents or the rebels. Ang papasok na lang doon sa international ay yung human rights. Okay? Yung human rights ang papasok, not the international humanitarian law papasok. Because uh, ang uh, ang covered ng international humanitarian law ay yung between countries lamang na armed conflict lang. And the law applies only once a conflict has begun. And then equally to all sides, meaning walang kikilingan dapat. Okay? Ng international humanitarian law. Ngayon, kapag, say for example, ah, ang Pilipinas ay na-visit sa China, ayan, so nagpalipad sila ng okay, ground-to-ground missile, say for example, or missiles. Tumama dun sa kanilang isang portion ng kanilang bansa. Papasok ba ay IHL? Hindi pa. Kasi nga, that is only an isolated act of violence. Pero pag talagang mayroon ng declaration ng war between the countries, ayun, kailangan papasok na ang international humanitarian law para mag-observe, makita kung may mga violations ang mga countries. Then, they shall be charged in the international court, in the international criminal court. So, what else? What about the Bible? Anong sinasabi naman patungkol sa gera? Well, sa Bible, maraming gera actually doon. Nagigera nung unang panahon, okay? Talagang maraming gera. In fact, yung gera, yung pagdami ng gera, yun din ang sinasabi na sign kung kailan babalik ang ating Panginoon Jesus. But we are not going to discuss that here. What I would like to share with you from the Word of God is James chapter 3 verse 5 to 8. So sinasabi doon, sa una niyan, sinasabi niya na yung kabayo ay pwedeng i-control pag meron kang tali na ilalagay sa may ilong niya or sa leeg niya, pwede mong makontrol. Ganon din yung barko, pwede mo siyang makontrol dun sa kanyang yung rudder na tinatawag natin sa ilalim niya. Now, sabi niya further sa verse 5, so also the tongue is a small member, yet boasts of great things. How great a forest fire is set ablaze by such a small fire, and the tongue is a fire, a word of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is restless evil, full of deadly poison. So meaning, merong isang nagpapasimula ng gera, yung dila natin, yung pananalita. Kapag hindi nag-declare ng war, or ang war ay, ang gera, ay nag-start yan sa declaration ng dila. No, ganun din sa pananalita natin. Nagkokos yan ng away, nagkokos yan ng enmity. Kaya mag-ingat sa pananalita. Kailangan paamuin mo yung dila kasi once na hindi magandang nasabi mo, it may cause the downfall of a person. It may cause also, okay, war between nations. Okay? So with that, thank you for listening. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, and God bless you all. Again, do not forget to click the notification bell if you have not subscribed yet my channel. God bless you all.